So in this segment, we're going to be talking about sacked Minister Sam Tarry talking on LBC about the situation. I'm not going to go through the entire clip. It's definitely worth listening to in your own time. I'll link it below in the description as always. I know people complain because I paused the video too much, but if you want, just click the link, just watch the video. If you want my commentary, just come back to this. Ben Kentis does some good work here. He does give him a lot of space to talk, and Sam Tarry evidently has a lot to say, and we'll be talking about it in a broader sense for the party and kind of my take on what's going on here.
Sam, you've been sacked from Labour's front bench this evening. You've been sacked from your role as a Shadow Transport Minister. What happened? Did Keir Starmer call you personally? How did you find out?
I had a constructive conversation with Alan Campbell, who I say has always been very supportive and very helpful to me as a front bencher, and then spoke to Keir, and we had a forthright and constructive exchange of views.
What did Keir Starmer say to you?
Look, it wouldn't be fair for me to go into that conversation, but obviously from his point of view, he thought that I'd overstepped the mark, I'd broken the kind of collective positions that he wanted to agree.
And he did, to be fair. The reason why he was sacked was for he's making policy on the hoof, says Keir Starmer, and that's effectively what he did. He kind of pushed for workers to get inflation level pay rises, etc., which I think, I don't think he was wrong to do, but at the end of the day, collective responsibility exists. The Labour Party, the ministers have agreed on a position, and he effectively agreed to that, and he essentially broke the code of conduct. So it was right for Starmer to sack him. The only thing it does show you is that there's a growing rift in the party between between I guess Starmer and the shadow cabinet and MPs, because as Sam Tarry kind of points out here, there's a lot of anger in the Labour Party over the fact that they're not doing enough on the situation with the strikes. They're not talking about enough, they're not supporting the strikers enough, or the unions enough. And I agree with that kind of take that Labour MPs should be angry about it, because at the end of the day, what's the point of the Labour Party if it's not going to fight for workers, if it's not going to fight for strikers, etc. And it's just ridiculous, the situation the Labour Party is in right now.
I put a different view forward, as you might imagine.
And this was because you joined the picket line and the RMT strike this morning?
It's RMT and TSSA. I was a former trade union officer with the TSSA, so people I knew and known for many, many years were on strike today, ticket office staff. So for me, it was going to be very difficult to avoid this one. I think that the Labour Party is born out of the trade union movement, and if we're not able to show solidarity and constructive dialogue with trade unions, then I think we have a real problem. The reality is,
at least Andy was spotted on the picket line as well recently, so if anyone arguing it's just because to be fair, Andy was spotted today, but if anyone to argue it's just because he was on the picket line, Sam Tarry, that's not the case. It was over policy.
That the country is going to become almost ungovernable over the next sort of 6 to 8 months as industrial disputes just break out all over, from barristers to doctors to nurses to lecturers. The reality is, if we had a Labour government, that wouldn't be happening. We would be able to actually be on a table with trade unions, have proper constructive discussions, and actually have an economic agenda that means that people aren't suffering in terms of low pay in the way that they are. Because look,
I think the issue is that I think some of the strikes could potentially be happening. It just depends on what the unions want in terms of a pay settlement. What do the unions want versus what would the Labour government be willing to give? That would be the key question here, because to argue that the strikes wouldn't be happening under Labour is simply not the case, because what if Labour don't offer what the unions actually want? That's the key problem. And without Starmer having a stance on it, I think the RMT want around an 8% pay rise with no redundancies, which again is below inflation. But would the Labour Party be willing to give that? That's the thing they don't answer. When it comes to things like public sector pay, Labour aren't offering a lot when it comes to nurses and people that work in hospitals, etc. So the argument that there wouldn't be strikes under a Labour government, I don't think that's true.
There's a lot of myths often put out in the media about, sort of striking rail workers. The reality is that most of the workers today, if they're in ticket offices, so TSSA staff, probably on £25,000, perhaps even less in some sort of train operating companies. And
some of them live in cities as well, places like London, which are incredibly expensive. So what that means is they can't afford to live. They can't afford to live in those cities, and at the end of the day, that's where they work. Ticket officers can't, ticket staff can't work from home.
RMT, the track maintenance staff and the safety critical staff, again, £25,000 to £30,000. These are not massive sums of money, decent wages, sure, but they're not huge sums of money by any stretch of imagination. So for these people to choose to have, foregone a day's pay, and to do so on several occasions, these are people who will also be struggling like every other person is in the country to put food on the table, to pay their energy bills and to, fill up the fuel to go into a car.
What Labour should really be talking about is it's not the fault of the unions here, and it's what the trade unions need to argue as well. Like, there are people who call into news or radio shows that argue, it's not fair that these people get to strike, etc. When these same workers, the ones that complain, aren't in union, so they have no kind of recourse to actually get the support that the workers that are on strike are getting. So it goes to show you how important unionisation is.
Keir Starmer says Labour needs to look like a government, your party needs to look like a government in waiting, and that people in government don't go and stand on picket lines. Do you see where he's coming from on this? He's got a point,
I think
hasn't he?
people in government do, because if we were in government, we would be sitting around that table, whether it be with Network Rail, whether it be with the train operating companies, as Grant Shapps full well knows, we would be saying, look, these are the parameters, these are the flexibilities you can have to come to a negotiated settlement. So we wouldn't need to be on the picket lines, because the picket lines wouldn't be taking place. I think it's wrong to say that any Labour politician, whether it be a councillor, whether it be an MP, whether it be a Shadow Minister, shouldn't be showing solidarity. And I think that we're going to see that hit breaking point over the next few months, as many other MPs who come from trade union backgrounds and represent, not just constituencies, but constituencies of support more broadly in the country, are going to be faced with a choice of doing nothing, saying nothing, or backing the people that they are, really kind of, I suppose, responsible in some ways for having supported them into Parliament to represent collective views of the trade union movement. And I think that if this isn't tackled properly, there's going to be a real danger that things, it won't just be me that's sacked. I think you'll see dozens and dozens of shadow ministers sacked.
And that's really interesting that evidently there is clearly a rift, not just amongst the Parliamentary Labour Party, the PLP, but also within the shadow cabinet, that evidently they are not happy with the situation by the sounds of it. And this is a person who was just fired from the shadow cabinet. He'd have a lot of friends there, a lot of people he would have spoken to before he did what he did. He was the only one brave enough to kind of speak out, I guess, against Labour Party policy. I mean, the argument that he should have resigned before he went on his tirade is true. But evidently he did it in a way where he wanted to expose the problems, I guess, within the party. He put Starmer in a position where he kind of had to sack him, and he did. The arguments he's making here, that people are, some of the striking workers and other workers may be asking their local Labour MP, what's going on here? What do you think about public sector pay, or do you support the strikes, etc.? Why aren't you out on the picket lines? Stuff like that. No doubt they'd be getting asked those sorts of questions. Labour MPs I'm talking about here.
Across the whole country, absolutely.
How upset, how angry are some of your colleagues about the position that your party?
I've just fielded phone calls from 7 different general secretaries, all Labour affiliated, one not Labour affiliated. Those general secretaries are absolutely fuming about what has happened today. They are now on direct collision course with the Labour Party leadership, and that was totally avoidable.
Let's not forget, some of these trade unions, the ones that are affiliated, do fund the Labour Party. So Labour are going against effectively the people that financially back them, which is always a very dangerous move.
Many of my colleagues from many different wings of the party are supporters of the trade union movement. There have been a mixture of views about whether or not we should have been on the picket lines today or not, but all of them would fully understand that collectivism, in terms of the values that we have as Labour Party MPs, means standing in solidarity with people, particularly low-paid workers who are really suffering. I mean, look, we've also had, over the past few weeks, the real kind of climate crisis coming to a crunch. The fires that are breaking out across Europe. In my neighbouring constituency, John Cruddas' seat, a whole range of houses were burnt to the ground, all because we haven't had any rain in London for the best part of 2 months. We can't credibly say we want to form a government if we don't have a plan to tackle the climate crisis. Tackling the climate crisis means getting people out of planes and onto trains, out of private vehicles, stopping and put fuel in the petrol pump and onto public transport.
And again, he's right here. That's the only way to stop the climate crisis, or at least reduce it. You need more people to take public transport, but you can't do that by trying to force people, out of cars and things like that. You have to give them a better option. Give people a better option of, do you know what, trains might be quicker, or it's going to be cheaper, so I'm going to take the train instead of driving that. That's what, has to happen here. And what he's evidently saying is there is no plan. There is no plan to for Labour to do this, take this kind of action. And through nationalisation, that could be one of the avenues Labour could take, try and reduce train costs and make them more effective and make it a better service.
And we need a credible plan to do that. Now, I've advocated a credible plan for that. This past week, we couldn't even be clear about our public ownership plans, whether it be for municipal buses or for rail.
So that's true. That was That was Rachel Reeves who caused that issue. Labour policy on rail ownership, a shadow cabinet at odds, conflicting statements from Shadow Cabinet Minister throwing Labour's current policy on rail ownership into confusion today, leaving it unclear as to whether Starmer's party backs nationalisation. Reeves told BBC on Monday morning that Labour would not go into the next election promising to take private rail, or energy or water companies under public ownership. That directly goes against Labour Party's current policy. She talks about fiscal issues, blah, 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 but I know that's nonsense. The answer raised further questions as Shadow Transport Secretary Louise Hay had assured the Labour affiliate rail union ASLEV during an interview in March that Labour backed public ownership of rail. So effectively, a Labour spokesperson had to come out here and say Labour's position had not changed despite remarks from Reeves, and the Shadow Chancellor has not heard the question properly. So they tried to argue she misunderstood the question, but I'm sure Reeves is smart enough, if she didn't understand the question, to ask again for the question to be repeated. The spokesperson said we're pragmatic about public ownership, and as long as it sits within our fiscal rules, a point Rachel Reeves was underlining in the interview by referencing the framework, blah 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 blah. That's not what they promised originally. And if they try and use the fact that the country doesn't have enough money, it's ridiculous. France fully nationalised EDF recently. Where did France get the money from to do that? Ridiculous statements from ridiculous politicians, these two. Absolutely can't stand them. You got the whole trade union thing. One of Scotland's most senior trade unionist has resigned from the Labour Party and called for his union to disaffiliate from the party. That's something that was mentioned earlier that I forgot to mention in passing at the relevant moment. But the simple fact is, you can see here there are major issues with the Labour Party. They cannot get their framing right. They cannot figure out what the hell they're trying to say to people. And it's evident that one Labour shadow member said, "Oh yeah, we are going to nationalise these institutions," and then another one said, "Oh, we might not be able to afford it." It's ridiculous.
Your issue with Keir Starmer is not limited to these strikes. You think he's got it wrong across the board on issues like rail nationalisation?
Well, actually, Keir Starmer agrees with me on rail nationalisation, and that is the current Labour Party policy.
What he said this week.
He had to come out and correct himself and say that was
He had to come out and correct himself, so he wasn't even mentioning the Reeves thing. He had to. I thought that's what he was talking about when I first heard this through, but I misunderstood what was being said here, because obviously Rachel Reeves is not a he. But point being is that even Starmer doesn't even know his own policies. Keir Starmer does not know his own policies on nationalisation. He had to come out and correct himself. That's madness.
The Labour Party policy, and you can confirm that with my former boss Louise Hay. It very much is still Labour Party policy because it's a pragmatic, common sense policy.
No, it's a policy that Starmer used to get himself elected during the leadership campaign. Let's be honest.
How on earth are we in a situation when rail companies are not even able to offer to striking workers? Not even able to match inflation. So in reality, what workers have been offered is a pay cut, essentially. At the same time as saying to them, well, okay, hold on. You've got two Conservative leadership candidates who are hell-bent on destroying 200 years of workplace rights that have been accrued in this country. We're not able to turn around and say, actually, we are going to stand in solidarity with you. This is clearly wrong. What's going on is wrong. And come out and say, as I did today, that if we were in government, these disputes wouldn't be taking place.
In fairness, that's what I think David Lammy said, that this dispute would not be taking place if Labour were in charge. But again, I asked the question, how? What would you do that would resolve these strikes? Because again, they've asked for a certain amount, a percentage increase, no redundancies. Are you going to offer them that? Or what kind of compromise could you come up with? That's the question I'd be asking. But Labour are being very coy on it. I don't know why, but they just are. I think maybe if the government could compromise on maybe 5% pay increase, no redundancies, maybe the union would take it. I don't know. But the fact is, let's not forget, these companies do make money. They pay out to shareholders despite taking subsidies. They're incredibly profitable. There are talks about some of these companies that are running the rail lines being purchased. So the argument that it's not worth it, they're being subsidised. They're making money. The rates got by RPI. When the train fares increase, they got by the retail price index. retail price inflation. So the argument that they can't pay their workers more when they're getting above, sorry, not above, when they're getting constantly inflation level increases in ticket prices is ridiculous. And the point, I'll leave it here for the interview. There's a bit more on it, which is it's definitely worth listening to. If you've got some free time today, just click it, just listen to it at 1.25 speed like I do. If you can handle that, go for it. It's a good interview. Ben Kentish gives Sam Tarry a lot of space to speak, and he asked some decent questions to kind of open up the conversation. Overall, I think it's a good interview. I learned a lot watching this. I didn't know who Sam Tarry was before he was sacked, and I've got a lot of respect for him now. I genuinely do. Anyways, let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.